Welcome back, everybody. Want to spend a little more time talking about some of the systemic issues in our country. And today we're going to focus on economics and economic well-being. And I'm going to try to remain calm. I'm not telling a lot of stories. I'm not getting real animated because I want you to be able to hear the facts and see the history. So let's talk about economics for a minute. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics started keeping records of black unemployment rates in 1972. And since that time, the rate of black unemployment has always been around twice that of white unemployment rates. And that is true in good economic times and bad. It isn't true in a boom economy or a bust economy. It's been true at pretty much every level of education. In fact, a lot of strides have actually been made in education concerning people of color. But even with that improved educational outcome, the job gains have not always kept up. For instance, while people with advanced degrees, so masters, PhDs, those people tend to have low rates of unemployment across the board. But the rate of African American unemployment of people with advanced degrees is about the same rate of unemployment as white Americans with just a bachelor's degree. And the rate of unemployment among African Americans with a bachelor's degree has typically run fairly close to the rate of unemployment of white Americans with a high school diploma. So we've made gains, but there's still this disparity. And in addition to having higher unemployment rates than whites with the same level of education, black workers still tend, over the past 40 years, have tended to be paid less than white workers in the same level of education category. So, let's talk for a minute about history and how we got to the place. And then we're going to come back at the end and jump back to where I just was, talking about unemployment rates and gaps in how people are paid. There are many estimates, but if you kind of put them all together, estimates would say that slaveholders extracted around $14 trillion worth of labor in today's dollars from African slaves before the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, I get you to work, you're not paid, I can use you as I see fit. I reap the economic gains of your labor and you reap none. So I am extracting that wealth from you. Now that wealth went somewhere, right? Pulling that wealth out of all of that labor, it goes somewhere. It goes into white slave owners' pockets, but that's not the only place it goes. Over time, it becomes invested in white institutions. It is put into white banks, which then make loans to other white people. It is, for generations, passed down in various ways and institutions to other white people. It has a massive economic impact, not only in that moment, but over time. Now, after the Civil War, slaves are freed. But most blacks are encouraged to stay in the South, stay where they are. They need jobs. The South needs labor for all of these jobs that used to be done by slaves. And so many of them entered into contracts doing the exact same work, sometimes for the families that previously enslaved them. And as you can imagine, those contracts were typically abusive. typically unfair, and typically did not pay well. And state and local governments colluded to enforce this kind of economic stranglehold on the black community by codifying things like, say, black codes. For instance, in South Carolina, black codes stated that black people, if they worked in any occupation other than farming or domestic servitude, in other words, the exact occupation of slaves, that if they tried to go into other occupations, they would be fined or sometimes arrested. At the same time, laws were passed that made it illegal, often, for someone from the north to cross state lines to come offer money for black families to move north. These were immigrant agent laws, and it helped to keep black people right where they were in a place of subservience. So, we see this today. Black or African American, Asian, Hispanic, Latino people comprise about 36 to 40% of our overall U.S. workforce, and yet they constitute around 60% of agricultural workers. 70% of maids and housekeepers. Around 75% of things like baggage porters and bellhops. All the same things that slaves, ex-slaves, and then people suffering under Jim Crow were kind of forced to do. And of course, these areas of employment do not tend to pay well. In the 1900s, the Great Depression comes along, and we have the New Deal. And part of that is the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, the Fair Labor Standards Act did some great things. It introduced like a 40-hour work week, put a ban on child labor, established things like a minimum wage and overtime, things like that. But while that FLSA kept things or made things better for a lot of workers across the United States, it largely excluded African American workers from receiving those benefits. And the ways it did it was by exempting certain things like agricultural services or domestic services. In other words, the rules applied to most things, but didn't apply to a few, which just happened to be areas where African Americans were primarily employed. At the same time, the National Recovery Act was passed. And as part of it, people asked for, it was proposed that there be a racial differential put into it. Now, the racial differential would be that we pay this much to white workers and we're allowed to pay this much less to black workers. In other words, it's cooked into it, where there is an actual distance set. Now, this was ultimately defeated. However, it was defeated in the idea that there was no federal rule allowing this differential. But, in essence, it existed, and here's how. Roosevelt at the time said, "It is not the purpose of this administration to impair Southern industry by refusing to recognize traditional differentials." In other words, the economy of the South is going to suffer if we recognize that we should pay black people the same as whites. So instead of having the differentials enacted, what they did is they set up statutes that made things like, hey, there's going to be different amounts paid based on geography. Well, and in some ways, this kind of makes sense to us, right? So it's much more expensive to live in New York than it is to live in Abilene, where I live. But people in New York and I, if we receive the same wage, it would be harder to live there. So you could see why someone might say there ought to be a different minimum wage in New York than there is in Abilene, Texas. That makes some logical sense. But here's how it actually worked out. There were exceptions made based on geography. Different geographical classifications allowed different payment. For instance, in the state of Delaware, Delaware was classified as being in the north when it came to 449 different industry codes. But it was classified as being in the south, able to pay less, with respect to the fertilizer industry. Why? 90% of the workers in the Delaware fertilizer industry were black. This is the way that systemic racism works in economics. It is not just simply writing laws that say, hey, we're going to pay black people less. It's figuring out ways to do that without saying it. Now, over time, many of the service vocations that people who were previously enslaved were forced to carry out, things like serving food, cutting hair, being a chauffeur. Over time, many of those industries became the places where we tip. Right? We don't tip everybody. You don't tip the CEO. There's a reason for that. But you do tip the chauffeur. Or you do tip the waiter. Or you do tip the barber. By making tipping a part of certain industries where a huge mass of African Americans worked, it gave exceptions to these industries that they did not have to meet the minimum wage. In other words, since these people are receiving tips, there won't be a minimum wage, or there'll be a small minimum wage. And guess what? Many of these people were unable to even reach minimum wage with their tipping because the tipping is up to the client. Now, all throughout this, people have recognized that some of this stuff isn't fair. There have been people who've fought against it, who've pushed back. One of the ways, for instance, is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Now, the job of that commission is to look for disparities in how people are paid, in discrimination in how people are hired, and to do something about it. To use the force of the federal government to make things better for African Americans. And at certain times, it has done that very well. But beginning in around 1980, the budget of that commission has been cut. It has not grown with the massive increase in the number of people we have in our country. And the number of people who work at the EEOC has also gone down by about half since 1980. So they have way less budget and way less people to keep track of where these disparities are happening. Now, right? No big deal. Well, here's why it is a big deal. Wages of white and black workers came as close to even as they have ever come in the year 1979. Since then, the gap has actually widened. Think about that for a second. We had this commission looking at ways to bring this thing together, and it was coming together. And then as we began to neuter that commission, things broadened again. Because systemic racism doesn't go away just because we say the laws have changed, because we say we want it to be different. It started growing again. Although the wage gap between black and white workers narrowed during the latter part of the 60s and through the 70s, Since 1979, the gap has widened. Now, there are lots of things that contribute to this. Limited wage growth among middle and low wage workers, right? Where we've seen gains in wages have been in high wage jobs, and we've seen how the economy has typically pushed African Americans into low wage jobs. Well, those wages haven't grown. And so it's created that disparity. There's been a growing racial inequality in hiring and pay and opportunities for promotion in many areas. And we're not doing as much to keep track of that and to use the weight of the federal government to stop that. And of course, if you don't raise the minimum wage and you have a lot of African Americans being pushed down to minimum wage or close to minimum wage jobs, economic disparity grows. In 1968, the median black household, now this would be, right, this is the height of the Civil Rights era. We're signing the Civil Rights Act. We were trying to make changes. In 1968, the median black household earned 63% of the income of the median white household. 63% in 1968. In 2016, the median black household earned 61% of the median white household income. Our history of systemic racism continues to affect our black brothers and sisters in how much money they can make, how much wealth they can acquire, their ability to buy a home, their ability to pay for quality of education for their children. It is not simply a matter of a few rogue cops. It is a matter of system that is working against the economic well-being of a large group of people.